There might be a lore reason for what I'm about to go over, but I'll be darned if I can find it. Over the course of several games, we have seen magic go from being immensely utilitarian and powerful to mostly combat, stealth, or charm oriented, and then become a pale shadow of its original form. This is probably partially because Bethesda wanted to make these games more and more new player friendly. While I can't fault them for that in particular, RPGs are awesome, and so many more people enjoy them nowadays partly because of Skyrim. I will certainly fault them for outright dumbing down or even crippling the magic systems. The magic should be, and often is, a massive draw to these games. When a tabletop group chooses to play in a setting with limited magic, they are making that choice for themselves. Usually for genre or story reasons, or to give themselves a challenge. That is not the case here. This is simply a company allowing what should be the most interesting part of their world to slowly fade from relevance. In Skyrim, outside of mods and shouts, magic is oddly limited. Okay, so let's talk about what you could do once upon a moon and star. Morrowind, the home of the Dunmeri people, is a nearly alien world. The magic wielded by this land's mages is frankly fundamentally superior to what can be learned in later games. Let's start high up on that list. Flight is one of the most useful abilities there is, and you can learn both a levitation spell and a speed enhancement spell in Morrowind. Levitation plus speed equals flight. This is not an ability that the practitioners of magic and Tamriel would forget lightly. And yet, in both Oblivion and Skyrim, it has been forgotten, or perhaps never learned. Although, it never being learned in Cyrodiil is absurd considering the Empire had people, including mages, in Morrowind. And nobody who learns that that kind of magic exists is going to ignore it, unless you're deathly afraid of heights, perhaps. As to the obvious reason for dropping levitation from these games, well, it's more difficult to design large areas or dungeons when you have to factor in free vertical movement. And Bethesda probably didn't want the additional strain of doing that. Oh, and as to that speed enhancement, yeah, about that, the mages of Morrowind can use magic to directly enhance basically any of their physical or mental traits. Making yourself stronger, faster, smarter, and more agile will always be useful. These effects could even be applied to permanent enchantments on clothing or jewelry, making them even more useful. You can still learn versions of these in Oblivion, but by the time Skyrim comes around, you really can't. No one who lives in a world as dangerous as Nirn would let something so useful be forgotten. And to make it even weirder, you can still learn to enhance things like skills and even your health in Skyrim, mostly through enchantments. But not your speed or strength, apparently. There are potions and enchantments that increase carry weight, however, that's all they buff, so they're not strength enhancements. The reason they dropped these is pretty obvious. Those RPG stats just don't exist in this RPG, which I think is a darn shame. Next up, summoning. This one's fun. Back in the day, you could summon multiple creatures as long as they were either different types or summoned with different spells. In Morrowind, you could use enchanted items to summon a small force to fight with you. This ability is once again too useful to forget, and yet in Skyrim, you have to have a special perk just to summon 2 creatures at once. Heck, the Caller, the leader of an actual school of conjuration, has to use a full-on ritual to summon just 3 of them. Admittedly, 3 of the same creature. You could argue for this magical ability, the Oblivion Gates being barred shut by Martin could affect the number that can be used. And your mastery of the skill allows you to sneak an extra Atronach through. But I don't think that's stated anywhere in the game's lore itself. And honestly, at this point, I'm not inclined to give Bethesda the benefit of any doubt. So why limit this ability in-game? Yeah, this one's obvious as well. It's simply for gameplay balance. You would be nigh unstoppable with a small army of Atronachs and Daedra at your command, and being unstoppable can get boring fast. It'd be awesome to try out, though. On to necromancy, the art of raising the fallen to serve your own will. Well, this one's all over the place. I don't think this one can really be explained by Martin's little dance with the devil. Although, I'm fairly certain it's not really made clear whether the Soul Cairn is an Oblivion plane or not, or if it was affected by the events of Oblivion. Yeah, okay, necromancy has always been a bit limited in these games, for the player. In Skyrim, you once again need either a perk or a ritual stone power to raise more than one undead servant at a time. And while the Dead Thrall spell that makes one of your raised dead a permanent follower is useful and frankly really cool, why is the player the only powerful mage who seems to have these limits? Many necromancers you encounter will have hordes of undead at their beckoning, while you usually have at most a couple. Unless you're abusing the heck out of the ritual stone power to make an army of undead, which is actually really fun. The Wolf Queen apparently had a full-on army of undead, and the Dragonborn, a being who should eventually easily surpass her in terms of raw power, gets a few. At least it's a few baby steps forward from the horrible necromancy in Oblivion. Which is bizarre because the entire main questline for the Mages Guild in Oblivion involves necromancy. This one was likely limited for the same game balance reasons as summoning. Curing spells. Oh boy, this is a big one. In Morrowind and Oblivion, you could learn spells to cure common diseases and poisons. In Skyrim, you have to pray at an altar or use a potion to remove diseases. So how, by the Nine Divine, were these spells ever lost? This is a world whose medical practitioners are almost all either magic users or alchemists. Unless they outright didn't know such spells existed, why would they fall out of practice? And most mages and priests definitely knew because you can buy a cure disease spell in Oblivion in almost any church. Every single mage who attends any mage school should be almost required to learn them on entrance, if for no other reason than to prevent the spread of any ailments within the school itself. And Imperial battle mages should almost certainly be required to learn both cure disease and cure poison spells. You never know what awaits on a battlefield. I have no idea why these spells were removed. They still exist in potions and through altars, and restoration is a full school of magic in Skyrim. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe it was an engine issue, then remembered there are very stable cure disease spell mods, so no real idea on this one. Enchanting is a weird one because it started broken, stayed broken, and ended broken. You can make some absurdly powerful constant effect items in Morrowind if you either get lucky or save and reload. Yeah, you had a chance to fail enchanting in Morrowind. The higher your enchanting, intelligence, and luck, the easier it is. But there was a point when actually pulling something off was next to impossible, provided you weren't already under the effects of previously made items or spells. But you can cheese that in all three games, so yeah. And in Morrowind and Oblivion, the spells you could add to enchanted items were simply the spells you had learned. In Skyrim, there is no inherent risk in enchanting, you have a 100% success rate, which is a bit odd considering you can eventually add 2 effects to an item, even if the combination of effects is frankly broken. Drain health plus drain stamina, along with the Soul Siphon perk, is kinda overkill. So in the case of enchanting, instead of balancing the ability, they just broke it in a different direction. Oops. Okay, so Bethesda obviously dropped the failure chance mechanic to be more new player friendly, which is fair enough. Less RNG isn't a bad thing most of the time, and they likely dropped the ability to add any spell you had learned to an enchantment because they didn't want players making god tier items. Yeah, it didn't take long for players to break the enchanting in Skyrim. Now to drive yet another nail into this magic system's coffin. Let's look at the actual difference in power between the most powerful magical organizations in each game, at least in theory. The Telvanni Master Wizards versus the Cyrodiil Mages Guild versus the College of Winterhold. This is actually a rather solid example of how magic weakened over time within these games. Because in a full-on 3-way confrontation, the Telvanni Master Wizards would outright body the other two groups, even if they worked together. I've said this before. When Neloth tells the Dragonborn he is likely the most powerful wizard they have ever met, despite his obvious ego, he is not exaggerating. There are more powerful wizards than him in the Elder Scrolls lore, but you're not really meeting them in Skyrim. Potema, the Wolf Queen, was immensely powerful in her own right, but you only encounter an echo of her true power. And despite Mirak's larger-than-life personality, the Dragonborn still wins that fight with relative ease. And he is beholden to that off-brand Cthulhu. So while it might be debatable, Neloth is almost certainly individually more powerful than either of them. Mirak can kill dragons, but so can Neloth, and without the need for any fancy tonal magic at that. And the Wolf Queen relied on an army of undead, which frankly on Solstheim, Neloth saw as a mild annoyance. He sees the Archmage of the College of Winterhold as unworthy to be his apprentice. And Neloth is not even the Telvanni's most powerful member. Now, as to Oblivion's Mages Guild, well, their most capable member is, while modestly powerful, a complete moron. Yeah, he knew Manny Marco was coming and decided to serve him up an army of potential loyalists on a silver platter. And then has to sacrifice himself to thwart the threat he had a hand in causing to become as big as it was. And that was their Archmage. Why? Just why? So yeah, Morrowind by and large has the most powerful mages and magic. The only caveat I can think of would be that the Psijic Order shows up in Skyrim, but I don't think even the writers knew just where the power scale for them is supposed to land. And frankly, if one did that fancy time stop magic around Neloth, I am dead certain he would notice and be none too pleased, or maybe even dangerously curious. After all, even Tolfdir felt something off during those events, and he keeps losing the same Alembic. Now, there is also the problem with certain spells in Skyrim. Master-level destruction spells, that is. Yeah, having a combat spell take long enough to cast that even some slower enemies can close the gap is ridiculous. If these spells had been designed for something like Demolition and simply used as combat spells by the mage community out of some weird laziness, that would have been kind of understandable. I can honestly see magic causing a kind of weird lazy attitude towards actual work. But spells actually meant for combat having a long casting time is a good way to lose more than just a fight. They would very quickly lose favor with the mage community. In Oblivion and Morrowind, casting a lot of spells was near instant, but cost more the more powerful the spell. Some spells had a short wind-up, but they weren't usually direct damage spells. Now, unfortunately, I don't think there's a simple way to fix this. To really fix the problems with Skyrim's magic system, you would kind of have to redo basically the entire system in Skyrim. Now, if it's possible, you could maybe tweak the casting time for Master Destruction spells so they aren't nearly useless in the middle of combat, and, frankly, cap the enchanting. It can get out of hand fast. Even if you're not actually trying to cheese it. The biggest problem, however, at least in comparison to the old games, is the lack of utility. As I've gone over, several of the most useful utility spells have simply been left to the wayside. Probably in part to make development easier, and in part to make the game more accessible for new players. But for those of us who played Morrowind, and then Oblivion, and then finally Skyrim, it can and probably did cause us to go, wait, what? Where the heck are all my spells? And I didn't even go over the water walking spells being lost. Yeah, in both Morrowind and Oblivion, you could walk on water. In Skyrim, you must have the Dragonborn DLC to do that, and it's limited to one enchanted item and a few non-brewable potions. Normally, that previous section is where I would go over potential fixes to an issue I have with whatever subject I'm rambling about. But obviously that didn't really happen here. Which is odd when you consider the developers of the mod Enderall actually took the bones of that system and fleshed it out pretty well. And many other modders have added their own interesting stuff to the base game. But they are better creation engine developers than modern Bethesda. Go away, Todd, I know what I said. The weirdest thing is Skyrim's magic system isn't completely horrible. There are some, even quite a few, good ideas and synergies in there. It's just not anywhere near as good as it could be. In Morrowind and Oblivion, when you reached really high magic levels, you felt like a powerful mage. Not necessarily unstoppable, but more like something that stepped out of a fantasy novel or even an anime. In Skyrim, the highest level magics are usually fun for a short time and then become progressively less so. Mostly because more powerful magic seems to become less useful the higher your level. Enemy leveling is a really tricky thing to balance in an RPG, even for a good developer. There was a weird thought that struck me while writing this script. The lack of a lot of RPG stats and elements in Skyrim might have something to do with Oblivion's terrible leveling system. Yeah, it was so bad, I can see it causing Bethesda to overcorrect and believe that that kind of RPG system could turn away new players. So instead of accepting that they screwed up and doing better next time, they just dropped that system altogether. That honestly seems like such a Bethesda thing to do. I truly hope, that when we eventually get The Elder Scrolls 6, that the magic system is more fleshed out and more thought out. But I'm not holding my breath on that one. Well, I suppose before my overthinking gets out of hand, I'll just say, thank you for listening to my inane ramblings.